All right, so now more than ever, we're seeing the federal government try to force correct the economy that they screwed up in the first place. And of course, their answer is always to gain more control. This is what happened in 2008 during the financial crisis, which is strikingly similar on a smaller scale to what we're seeing right now. It was perhaps the greatest financial takeover of the free market since we left the gold standard. And it happened right under our noses. Most people had no idea. Now, leading up to 2008, the U.S. government had encouraged banks to make high-risk loans in the form of mortgages to people with very bad, very little, or almost no credit at all. There's a great movie about this called The Big Short. I encourage you to go watch it. Now, home values soared because virtually anyone could get a huge mortgage with no money down. Now, some economists, warned that the housing market, which made up to almost 20% at the time of a $15 trillion GDP, was far too leveraged. What happened? Well, we all know the bubble burst. And when short-term interest-only loans needed refinancing, or when all those people who got a mortgage with no money down realized they couldn't afford them anymore, they started putting those houses on the market. More supply, not enough demand, made the value of homes tank. A lot of people with 100+% mortgages realized that they were never going to get out of their house that was now on the market, and they just stopped paying their loans. They walked away. All at the same time. And the banks crashed almost overnight. Now, the government swooped in with this fancy term they called quantitative easing. This is AKA, they printed money for the big bank bailout. Now, up until 2008, the Fed had only controlled really short-term interest rates. You know, the free market decided the long-term and naturally set it on that. So based on the supply and demand, the free market decided what a long-term bond was worth. But in 2008, then Fed Chair Ben Bernanke just unilaterally decided that the government would now set long-term interest rates right under our noses. The federal government, while people were losing their homes, used a short-term crisis to gain long-term control, using your tax dollars to do it. How? Well, check this out. This is the Federal Reserve balance sheet. Now, in order to control the long-term interest rate, the government had to buy back enough of the privately owned long-term bonds from pensions and banks and insurance companies and even other countries to assert their control, much like a hostile takeover of a company board, where they buy enough of the board or buy enough of the company to sit on the board and make all the decisions. They essentially bought their own bonds back from us with the money they printed. It's unbelievable. The federal balance sheet more than doubled, went from $900 billion to over $2.2 trillion in a matter of months. As with anything else, the government doesn't really care if they're getting a good deal. They don't care what the bonds cost because they just printed the money to buy them. But what did this do? Goes back to supply and demand. Because people knew the government was buying back their bonds at whatever price they demanded, the price of bonds went up. This drove the yields, which is also the interest rate, on the same bond down. Also did it to the economy. Now, that combined with the fact that the Fed now owned enough of the market to control the rates unilaterally. They held the long-term interest rates that set mortgages and car loans and debt or whatever at like 0.25% for 8 years. They just infused more free money into the economy. Look, I have my own issues with Trump's spending. However, thank God for his economic policies, because it allowed enough growth for the Fed to raise interest rates a little bit, which gave some economic cushion when this whole thing happened again during COVID. Now, remember how much the federal balance sheet was back in 2009. Take a look. All right. So in comparison, look at what it did during COVID when the government printed more money. That's a big difference. We just did it again on a massively larger scale. We never learn from history. Here's the problem, and this is what Democrats and, quite frankly, most Republicans don't get. I mean, I have no college degree, and I managed to understand this. I don't know how people in Congress don't. It's not a problem until it is. And then people are like, how did we let it get here? Because there comes a point when we have to pay our bills, too. Now, look, the government has record debt, $33 trillion. And when we're servicing it with over 20-year highs in interest rates. There's a point when those bonds that we use to cover our reckless spending, because when there's a deficit, we have to issue bonds to cover it, They'll become worthless because nobody will want to buy them. China has its own economic problems. They're not buying our debt anymore. And with a ton of inflationary concerns right now, companies, the banks and insurance places and things like that that used to buy them en masse, they're actually cautioning the size of their bond portfolios. We just saw a couple banks crash because of their bonds. SVB, remember that? Why though? Because if you bought a bond, as most banks did, most insurance companies, it was a 2 or 3% yield over 30 years. That same bond you bought 18 months ago has now lost close to 40% of its value when it's stacked against current interest rates, inflation, and the yield curve. The financial sector is now betting less and less on America. This means the value of the U.S. bond, our ability to print money, is lower, which, as I said earlier, inversely drives the yield return. That's the interest rate. That goes higher because they have to entice you to buy it, which ironically will be paid back then by them selling more bonds to us. Bernie Madoff, ironically, was sentenced to 150 years in prison for running the exact same concept in the private sector, and the government does it to us every day. But here's the bigger problem with the government controlling both levers of the economy, spending and interest rates. The imposed higher interest rates are essentially enticing people to borrow less and save more. People hold off on buying that house, that car, making that credit card purchase so they don't have to pay the high interest payments. Rising interest rates stall the economy, which is what the Fed is doing right now to equalize their massive spending spree. And there's not a thing you and I can do about it. That's the most frustrating thing. The Fed is just a bunch of people sitting in a room making decisions. But what happens then? All of a sudden, people have more money in bonds than they do in the economy. While the increased interest rates are combating inflation, yes, they are. We're already seeing it, but employment is ticking up. Also, with less employees in these companies, they produce less. The government, who now, since 2008, has total control over this, could artificially lower rates again, but if they do, inflation will soar. It's a rock and a hard place. But, mark my words, this failing Democratic Party, and they are flopping right now, they don't care about the economy beyond the next election. They are looking for short-term solutions to make them look good through 2024, which is even more dangerous. They are desperate, with a ton of power that they took during a crisis they created. Lends you to question if the government even knows what the hell they're doing. Should these people even be pulling the levers of the economy? I don't think so.